Why is it that every time an African leader dares to pull away from the West, especially France, the same story repeats itself? First, the media labels him corrupt. They call him a dictator. And when that fails, something far more dangerous happens: an assassination attempt. And now, the cycle has returned. Just days ago, Chadian President Mahamat Idriss Déby became the latest target. Armed men tried to end his life, but thanks to the swift response of Chad's military, the plot collapsed before it could succeed. Still, the question hangs heavy in the air: who was behind the attack, and why now? The capital city of Chad, N'Djamena, turned into a battlefield. A group of armed fighters stormed the presidential palace in broad daylight, an attack as bold as it was deadly. According to government spokesman Abdourahamane Tiani, 24 men launched the assault. They weren't carrying rifles or explosives. Instead, they came armed only with knives. But when security forces responded, the palace erupted in gunfire. 18 of the attackers were killed on the spot. One member of Chad's security forces also lost his life. Inside the palace at that very moment was President Mahamat Idriss Déby Itno. He had just concluded a high-level meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who was in the country on an official visit. Footage of the aftermath paints a chilling picture: bloodied bodies lying near a white pickup truck, grim evidence of how close the attackers came. Tiani confirmed that the fighters had managed to breach the outer camp guarding the presidency before being stopped. "I was impressed by the military deployment. We have a very good army, and the Chadians can sleep soundly. Our country is well guarded," said Minister Tiani with confidence. Authorities later confirmed that at least 6 suspects had been arrested in connection with the attack. Who they are and who sent them remains a mystery. Investigations are still underway. In the days that followed, life in N'Djamena slowly returned to normal. Shops reopened, schools resumed, government offices and businesses unlocked their doors. The city, shaken but defiant, tried to move forward under the promise that the situation was firmly under control. But beneath the calm, voices of condemnation grew louder. Citizens of Chad rejected the violence outright, calling for dialogue and peaceful ways to resolve political disputes. "We are in the digital age," said Mbaira Maji Desiree, president of the Association of Young Rainbows for Social Stability in Africa. "There are many other legal ways to make ourselves heard. This culture of violence does not reflect the generation we are." The same message echoed across the Chadian Youth Parliament. Its president, Jamous Bichara Beshir, denounced the attackers, calling the assault on the palace a senseless act. "You have to be an unconscious young person to attack the symbol of our sovereignty," he declared. "Our country has suffered too much from violence. It must stop." Now comes the question everyone is asking: who was behind the attack? Since Wednesday, theories have flooded N'Djamena. Some point fingers at Boko Haram, a name Chad knows all too well. It wouldn't be the first time. Since 2013, the jihadist group has carried out dozens of assaults inside Chad. In 2015, their suicide bombers struck police buildings and markets in N'Djamena itself. More than 50 people died. Over 100 were injured. Those who believe Boko Haram is responsible say this latest assault could be revenge. In October 2024, President Déby launched Operation Haskanite, a campaign to hunt down Boko Haram cells after the group ambushed Chadian forces in the Lake Chad Basin, killing more than 40 soldiers. The operation hit hard. Entire networks of fighters were tracked and dismantled. Could this attack on the presidential palace have been Boko Haram's answer? A bloody message that their war with Chad is far from over? But authorities in Chad were quick to dismiss the Boko Haram theory. In an interview with state television just hours after the attack, government spokesman Abdourahamane Tiani insisted the attackers were not jihadists. They weren't part of any organized armed group at all. Instead, he described them as drunken pieds Nicolais, a nod to a French comic about hapless crooks. Yet that explanation leaves more questions than answers. Could a group of clumsy criminals really storm the presidential palace, the most heavily guarded site in the nation's capital? Many find that hard to believe. Takilal Ndolassem Hilaire, national advisor and president of the Front for the Liberation of Chad, offered a very different perspective. According to him, the January 8th attack was no random act. It was the direct result of France's resistance to Chad's independence. He argued that Paris has long viewed Chad as a strategic free aircraft carrier, a base of power in Central Africa. And now, as Chad shows signs of breaking free, France is unwilling to let go. The politician went even further. He claimed it was no accident that French authorities exaggerated the events in N'Djamena, branding it a coup d'etat. According to him, the West often inflates such incidents, framing them as crises only they can solve, a strategy designed to reinforce their influence while undermining African sovereignty. Then came an even more explosive allegation. He argued that the financing of terrorism itself often comes from Western hands. He pointed to military leaders who, after being captured, allegedly admitted under interrogation that their funding came from the West. And here's where things get even more unsettling. Just days before the palace attack, French President Emmanuel Macron made a statement that many in Africa found insulting. Speaking of Francophone countries, including Chad, he declared that he was still waiting for thanks from the Sahel states. Macron argued that France had saved these nations from militant control back in 2013 and insisted that Paris had made the right choice to intervene militarily. Then, almost mockingly, he added, "I think they forgot to thank us. But that's okay. It will come in time." Those are not the words of a neutral partner. They sound more like the anger of a man scorned, a leader furious that African nations dared to humiliate France by rejecting its troops and reclaiming their independence. But that wasn't all. Macron's words cut deep. He didn't just defend France's presence in Africa, he went further. He boldly claimed that none of the Sahel states would even exist as sovereign nations if it weren't for France's military interventions. To many Africans, this wasn't just arrogance. It was a reminder of the old colonial mindset that African survival somehow depended on France's protection. But N'Djamena didn't stay silent. Chadian authorities responded with sharp defiance. They rebuked Macron's statement and reminded the world that Africa's independence came from African blood, not French benevolence. In a communiqué circulated to the public, they urged Macron to stop lecturing Africa, to respect African sacrifice, and to turn his focus inward, toward the economic and political crises tearing France apart. Yet their response didn't stop at words. It came with a deadline. The Chadian government reaffirmed that French troops must withdraw by January 31st, 2025. That date is not just symbolic. It represents the moment France loses its final military stronghold in the Sahel. Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali had already expelled French troops. Chad was the last line, the final base from which France projected power into the region. For Paris, this was a nightmare scenario. To lose Chad meant more than just losing soldiers on the ground. It meant losing influence, leverage, and decades of dominance in Central Africa. France may have expected rejection in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. In those countries, French-backed leaders were overthrown by military coups, and the new rulers, Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani, were not shy about their intentions. They declared openly that sovereignty mattered more than French partnership. They cut the ties quickly and decisively. But Chad was supposed to be different. For more than 3 decades, under the rule of Idriss Déby Itno, Chad was one of France's most loyal allies. Déby's regime, from 1991 until his death in 2021, relied heavily on French support, military, financial, and political. In return, Paris could count on N'Djamena as a reliable partner in the fight against jihadists, a staging ground for French operations, and a political buffer against instability in the Sahel. Idriss Déby was often called France's strongman in Central Africa. When he was killed on the battlefield in 2021, many feared that Chad's alliance with France might unravel. But his son, Mahamat Idriss Déby, took power with French blessing. Paris assumed the partnership would continue, and for a while, it did. France still maintained a military presence in N'Djamena. French influence remained deeply embedded in Chad's political and economic structures. To the outside world, Chad seemed like the last pillar of France's crumbling African empire. That's why the current shift is so shocking. For France to be forced out of Chad, the country it considered its last stronghold, is a humiliation of historic proportions. It's not just about military withdrawal, it's about the collapse of France's entire Sahel strategy. So the timing of the assassination attempt raises dangerous questions. Was it really a random act by hapless crooks, as the government spokesman claimed? Or was it something more? Was this the desperate act of forces determined to keep Chad tied to France? Forces unwilling to watch Paris lose its last grip on the region? Because if Chad expels French troops at the end of January, then for the first time in decades, the Sahel will be free of direct French military control. And history has shown us one thing. When African leaders take steps toward true independence, they often pay a heavy price. Just ask Thomas Sankara. Just ask Patrice Lumumba. Just ask Muammar Gaddafi. Is Mahamat Idriss Déby next on that list? It was no secret that Idriss Déby's grip on Chad was tied directly to France's support. For 3 decades, Paris stood firmly behind him, militarily, politically, and financially. By 2021, Déby had already secured victory in another election, one that would have kept him in power for a 6th term. But fate had other plans. His death on the battlefield ended that ambition abruptly. According to Chad's constitution, the rules were clear. Upon the death of a sitting president, the Speaker of Parliament should take over as interim leader. But that's not what happened. Instead, after Idriss Déby's funeral, a different scene unfolded. Standing alongside Chadian generals was none other than French President Emmanuel Macron. And with France's backing, the military quickly installed Mahamat Idriss Déby, the late president's son, as interim leader. For Paris, it was a calculated move. Installing Déby's son meant preserving continuity. It meant ensuring Chad remained loyal to France, keeping its bases secure and its influence intact. Whether the move was undemocratic or unconstitutional didn't matter. For France, maintaining control mattered more. This wasn't new. For decades, France had supported authoritarian regimes in Chad in exchange for loyalty on the battlefield and access to military bases. Chadian soldiers fought alongside French troops in counterterrorism campaigns, serving as a proxy force to secure France's interests in the Sahel. That support went far beyond politics. It extended to direct military intervention. In 2019, when rebels threatened Idriss Déby's rule, Paris responded immediately. At his request, France deployed 7 fighter jets. For 4 days, they bombed a rebel convoy in northern Chad, wiping out the threat and saving Déby's regime from collapse. Moments like that explain why Idriss Déby was able to hold power for so long. Every time his rule was threatened, France was there, ready to strike, ready to defend him. But now, his son faces a different reality. France's support is no longer the shield it once was. And as Chad prepares to expel French troops, the question becomes chillingly clear. Without Paris's protection, can Mahamat Déby survive? Given France's long history in Chad, no one in Paris expected betrayal. After all, France had been Chad's most loyal backer for decades, and Macron himself had personally ensured Mahamat Idriss Déby's rise to power after the death of his father. That's why Chad's sudden decision to end its defense pact with France cut so deep. For Macron, it wasn't just a diplomatic setback. It was a personal humiliation. His words about still waiting for thanks from the Sahel were not the remarks of a confident leader. They were the bitter outburst of a man who felt abandoned. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Is it just a coincidence that only days after Macron's angry statement, Mahamat Déby was nearly assassinated in his own palace? Or is it something far more sinister? History suggests we shouldn't dismiss the possibility. France has been accused time and time again of orchestrating or backing assassination plots in Africa whenever its dominance was threatened. Take the case of Thomas Sankara. Sankara wasn't just a president, he was a symbol. A man who rejected the luxuries of power and chose to live like the people he served. While modern African leaders filled their palaces with gold, Sankara lived in a modest brick home. While others drove expensive cars, he pedaled a bicycle to work and later switched to a small Renault 5, the cheapest car in Burkina Faso, only because his cabinet insisted. His clothes were simple too. He wore only cotton grown, woven, and stitched in Burkina Faso, turning even his wardrobe into a political statement of independence and pride. In every choice he made, Sankara embodied the opposite of the elite rulers Paris preferred, men who lived lavishly while their citizens suffered. He proved that true leadership didn't require luxury, but sacrifice, and for that, he became too dangerous. His mindset was different from every other leader. When he came to power, Sankara reasoned that Burkina Faso was the way it was because of the political leaders, so he decided to change the status quo of things. He put an end to politicians living extravagant lives funded by taxpayers' money and cut down the salaries of every politician, including himself. The Mercedes-Benz fleet for high-ranking officials was phased out, and the cars were replaced by Renault 5s. The wealth from land and oil was nationalized. His reign brought about a change in the health, education, and the environmental sector of Burkina Faso. Mass vaccination efforts were launched with a speed and success that was unusual for an African country at the time. Infant mortality rates fell, school attendance rates doubled, and millions of trees were planted as part of a long-term effort to combat deforestation. Feminism was also a fundamental component of political philosophy, manifesting itself in increased access to education for girls and the involvement of women in positions of leadership. Sankara even went further to institute a day of solidarity in which men swapped typical gender responsibilities, such as going to the market and running the family, in order to better understand what women face on a daily basis. It was the biggest success story in African history until it was interrupted in blood in 1987. Sankara was 37 when he was gunned down on October 15, 1987, along with 12 other men. His life was cut short by a gunshot, which, according to witnesses, was ordered by former Liberian President Charles Taylor with the cooperation of the French and American governments and delivered by Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's longtime friend and colleague. Sankara remains one of the continent's admired leaders, and his vision of Pan-African flourishing and an end to colonialism have long remained his legacy. Another African leader who was murdered with the support of France was Sylvanus Olympio. Togo's journey to independence can never be spoken of without talking about Sylvanus Olympio, the man who helped the country reach independence from France and paid the price for it. To frustrate Olympio's and the Togolese population's desire for independence and self-government, France demanded a payment of 800 million francs from the tiny West African colony, with meager earnings to cover the cost of the so-called benefit of France colonization. Understanding that France was trying to keep their hold on the country, Olympio immediately set to work for 2 years, putting Togo's land and human resources to use in order to compensate France. But what about Félix Moumi from Cameroon? On November 3, 1960, Félix Moumi, the famous independence fighter of Cameroon, also called Cameroon's Lumumba, died in Geneva, following an official independence from France earlier that year. Félix Moumi was the leader of the political movement Union du Peuple Camerounais, UPC, a major political force demanding the end of UN trusteeship over Cameroon and full independence of the country. Sadly, he was poisoned by thallium by an agent of the French Secret Service. The Swiss authorities knew who assassinated Moumi, but under pressure from Paris, never indicted him and dismissed proceedings, and no one has been charged since. Cameroon was strategically important to the French government. Paris feared that if they were defeated by Moumi's UPC, a left-wing independence movement, France would lose not only Cameroon but also other possessions in Western and Central Africa. And so, Félix Moumi had to disappear, and his movement had to be eliminated at any price. Following a mission to Geneva in October 1960, Félix was invited to dinner on the eve of his return to Conakry by 66-year-old William Bechtel, who claimed to be a journalist. Unfortunately, it was at that dinner that Félix was poisoned with thallium by William, who was a member of the French assassination unit called Le Main Rouge. So, if France could have all these people assassinated, it certainly could have the Chad president assassinated as well. What do you think? Let us know in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.